This is the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. Andy Payton is the lead pastor at Methodist Temple United Methodist Church in Evansville, Indiana. Randy Moore is associate pastor at Methodist Temple. Their goal is to see Christ in everything and everyone.
Welcome in, friends, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Randy Moore. As always, I'm joined by Pastor Andy Payton. Andy is the lead pastor here at Methodist Temple in Evansville, and I'm the associate pastor. And this is our podcast, and this is our weekly visit. And we probably spend more time like this of solid time than we do throughout the week, it seems like. So it's always good to sit down and talk about what's going on in our church. And
I think of it like my weekly spiritual check-in in many ways, and everyone else gets to join in with this.
Yeah, that's what makes it nice.
It's really nice.
Yeah. So we got away from something that we really started our podcast with, and that was a spiritual check-in or a soul check-in. And so that goes back to John Wesley, and the question, I believe, more precisely is, how is it that your soul prospers? And I think that really challenges us to look at the ways in which our souls are fed, right?
Yes. It does frame it more in terms of a spiritual check-in when you think of it in terms of, like, how does my soul prosper? How is my soul growing? Nevertheless, it's a great question to ask ourselves. And so how is it with your soul, Randy? I guess we'll start there.
Yeah, well, my soul and my body, and they're not separate. We talked about this last week. They aren't really separate. It's all together, at least in the Hebrew way of looking at it. And there are other ways of looking at it.
Our inner self as a whole.
Yeah.
Is our soul.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what's going on in my body can't be separated from what's going on in my spirit. And so I've been dealing with an ankle injury now for 7 weeks and a few days. And I'm beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I mentioned last week that just doing some reading, I don't generally consult Dr. Google, but I went to Dr. Google for something last week. I don't even remember what it was. And it said, be careful about depression that might creep up. And I hadn't really thought about being depressed, but I thought, wow, that is something that you need to consider, because it is something that an injury to that extent where you really can't walk, you really can't do anything. My wife has been so good. I mean, she's just been taking care of me, and I'm beginning to slowly, take over some of those things, some of those responsibilities. But just to think about that, and then to see the light at the end of the tunnel, has done my soul good. It's done my soul good, because, of course, there was a time when I wondered, am I going to have lingering effects from this?
Right? Sure.
Am I going to carry? And this is more information probably than you or anybody else needs, but I went to my first physical therapy session, and they measured my range of motion in my ankle, and up and down, it's almost full range of motion already before therapy. And side to side, it's not quite that good, but it's good for where I am. So that's all been good for my soul.
Good.
Yeah. How about you?
I'm a little tired today.
Okay.
And there's reasons for it. Our youngest, Ella, got into the bed with us last night. And then our other youngest, Chip, our dog, got into the bed with us last night, which meant that I slept on the couch half the night. And at one point, the security company we use from the church called my phone, because it happens, like the wind blows or something and one of the alarms gets tripped, and then anyhow they call, and I didn't sleep good. And I'm paying the price for it. But all in all, I think at this moment my soul's pretty good, considering.
Well, good. You talk about sleep. That's one thing. This is kind of a flip from what I was talking about before. I was not going to work. I was out of work for 4 weeks at the television station. I was actually getting more sleep then than I got before I was injured, because because I would get home at 10:30. Get home at 11. Probably wouldn't be asleep until 11:30. Up at 6 or 7. And so I was getting good sleep. And so I've had to sort of watch that. Like, I got to make sure, even though I'm back on my work schedule, which is essentially second shift, I've got to watch and make sure I get enough sleep. So important. But you're going to have nights like you had last night. That's it.
That's life, right?
Inevitable.
It's inevitable, yeah.
Yeah. Hey, we're doing this sermon series on the stained glass windows here at Methodist Temple. On the east side of the sanctuary, the Beatitudes are depicted, and on the west side, some of the parables of Jesus. And on June 2nd, I'm going to be preaching, and I'm going to be preaching on Blessed are you when you're persecuted. So as I left Sunday night, we have a contemplative prayer group that meets at 5 o'clock on Sunday night. And as I was leaving, I went through the sanctuary and I looked at that window, which I had never really looked at before. Mm-hmm. I've seen those windows as a whole, but I've never really looked at that because I wanted to sort of prime the pump for my sermon on that. And I'm going to have to go back to it and look at it again to interpret what the designer of the window had in mind. And I'm sure that's what you've been doing every single week because it's not plain. The message is not plain.
It's not always apparent.
Yeah.
When you just a glance at the window. I mean, this weekend, for example, was blessed are the pure in heart. They'll see God. At the bottom of the window, there's like a family. There's a dad, there's a mom, and there's a child, and the child's holding a lily. Now, you can look at that and be like, well, okay, whatever. Well, I did. I kind of went a step further. I looked into it, and a lily is a symbol of purity. Yeah. And I'm sure that's why the artist used that. I would have never known that
right.
if I didn't look into it. But it really does help to the word would be contemplate, chew on. What is this window saying to me? What's this art? How's God speaking to me through this window? Yeah.
The other thing that's helpful about that is that whoever designed those windows interpreted the parable in a certain way.
Yes.
And the interpretation is important because there is no one interpretation that has the final say. That's one of the things that I've finally been able to give into. Like early on in my faith, I'm like, the Bible is this answer book, and if I just search far enough, I'll find the definitive answer for something. But that's not it at all.
No,
that's not it at all. It's taking in somebody's interpretation, and in this case, it's through a stained glass window, and meditating on that. And then somebody else could have come up with a completely different window. Now there would be something in common when you're looking at, blessed are the pure in heart, right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot of latitude in there.
Well, I mean, there's as many interpretations as there are interpreters, really. Mm-hmm. I would say some answers are closer to the right answer than others, I mean, I think we could go too far at times. Right. I mean, there are some times where, we'll take a passage. I've done this. Anyone who's done this, has ever preached, you'll take a passage out of Scripture. It's really eisegesis instead of exegesis. And what I mean by that is you just cherry pick a verse out of its context and really are using it in a way that it was never intended.
Right.
And that's a danger you always have to watch. But overall, the Beatitudes especially, I feel like they are written in such a way where there's a lot of, creative possibility when it comes to our interpretation and application of them.
Well, again, and this may go deeper than we really need to go, but even Luke, when he had in front of him the Beatitudes, and Matthew had in front of him the Beatitudes, these sayings, the saying of Jesus, collection of saying of Jesus that had been passed down through the tradition, they both wrote it up differently.
Yeah.
Even in the Bible.
Yeah. Well, and we've talked about this on the podcast before. There are 4 different gospels, and they're very different gospels. It's the story, but it's not exactly the same story. And the way I would explain it is what the gospels capture is the Spirit of Christ, but in different voices, right? And so Luke talks about the Sermon on the Plain. Matthew talks about the Sermon on the Mount, but it's the Spirit of Christ that is moving through these moments and these stories, but they're different voices because they're different authors and they're a little bit different perspectives and context.
Different communities and
different questions. And you honor that. You really do, and celebrate that because that's how God works with us, right? I mean, we're trying to live into the Spirit of Christ, but we are different voices, and there's a diversity of voices. And really, to me, that's one of the real strengths of Christianity. We don't all embody and incarnate God's love in the same ways. It's a little bit different for each of us. It's powerful stuff if you stop to think about it, because if there's not just one way to do it, there's multiple ways of doing it. boy, how do you stop a movement like that? You can't, because it's just going to pop up all over the place. And now we're really going off track, I know, but it's just beautiful. It's like this tapestry of God's love, and God's love is the body of Christ, the people.
Very good. Okay, let's jump into it. Let me go ahead and read the Beatitudes, and then we'll jump back and focus in on the sixth one out of 9. So it's Matthew 5, 1 to 12. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he began to speak and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. This is the one we're focusing on this week. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Want to say anything in terms of a review before we jump in on this, on the pure in heart? I mean, we're 6 deep now.
Well, I mean, overall, when we're thinking through the Beatitudes, what Jesus is describing really is the disposition of the heart of a believer. And what these are all kind of pointing to is the characteristics of what it means to have the heart of Christ and the mind of Christ. And while the human tendency is to reduce this faith and the spiritual journey in terms of a bunch of externals, what Jesus is kind of depicting here is a series of internals that he's more interested in. This is more important to him. And so I'm not going to go through every one of them. Just think about that as we get into this. And certainly this idea is reflected as we turn to our beatitude for this podcast today. Blessed are the pure in heart, they'll see God.
And week after week after week, we're speaking about the same people. It's not as if we say, hey, you're the poor in spirit, you stand there. Those who mourn, you're over there. No, he's talking about, as you say, a disposition of the people of God.
Same spirit, and you're looking at it from different angles, really, is what I feel like the Beatitudes are really trying to get at.
Yeah.
Yep.
You started your sermon Sunday with a story about Henry Nouwen. We both love him so much. You want to share that story?
Sure. Well, he's a spiritual hero of mine. That's really how I started my sermon. I said to the church, if you've been to Methodist Temple for very long, if you've even listened to the podcast for very long, you know Henry Nouwen is one of our spiritual heroes. I was introduced to him actually from Bishop Mike Coiner. That's kind of where I began my journey with Nouwen. And so Coiner was the bishop when I first became a minister in the United Methodist Church. And I've always looked up to him. I continue to look up to him. I love our current bishop, sure, but Coiner, well, he was the one that was there when I was young, and it was really a formative time of my ministry. But he would give a devotion based on one of Nouwen's books, and I was around long enough to hear it a couple different times. And the book he would do the devotion on was Life of the Beloved. And it's a wonderful read. If you've not read Life of the Beloved, it's probably my favorite, maybe my favorite Henry Nouwen book. In any case, in that book, Henry tells a story. Towards the end of his career, he left academia. Nouwen was a professor at Harvard, Yale, Notre Dame. He was sought after as an author, as a speaker. He burned out. Towards the end, he burned out, and he left academia. And of all things, became a chaplain at a community in Toronto that was dedicated to serving the needs of the mentally and physically handicapped folks of the world. And the thing that is important, just as we get ready to get in this story, the thing that's important for this moment here is that Henry was no longer worshipped as Henry the speaker. Henry was no longer worshipped as Henry the teacher or any of those things. Henry in this community called L'Arche, was able just to be Henry, and he was free to love. And here we find something that captures what it means to be pure in heart. I'm not trying to play the game. I'm not trying to live up to someone else's expectations of me. I'm just simply freely loving. That's purity of heart, really, in a nutshell. But he tells a story, though. He held a chapel service there at L'Arche. And at the end of the chapel service, one of the residents comes up to him, and her name was Janet. And Janet says to Henry, Henry, I want a blessing. I want a special blessing. And Henry, being a Roman Catholic priest, he was a Jesuit. He did the Catholic thing. He did the sign of the cross on Janet's forehead, and, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, be blessed. And Janet protested. She says, no, Henry, I want a real blessing. I want a real blessing, she says. And not knowing what else to do, he hugs her. And she lays her head on his chest, and his vestments, his pastoral robe, literally swallows her up. And he says to Janet, you're a beloved child of God. You have a beautiful smile. We know you're low sometimes. We know you get down. You need to know you're loved. At which point one of the other residents raised their hand and said, hey, I want a blessing too. And every resident in that, it was like 30 people in that service, all came forward, and he hugged them and spoke those words, sort of words, into them. Even the 24-year-old intern that wasn't even sure about God wanted a blessing, wanted those good words over their lives. And for me, this is a moment, again, of purity of heart, because it's just free. It's just for love. It's free love. I'm giving out love. And for me, like, I think deep down, there's a common human hunger around every corner, around every turn. We want to be loved. We want to be celebrated. We want to be appreciated. And that hunger that is universal for humanity, in the Christian sense, that hunger really is ultimately a hunger for God. It's a hunger for God's unlimited love. And so when I say we want a blessing, we need a blessing, we're looking for those words. That's the real word we're looking for, that unlimited, infinite love of God. And so to understand God's love for us and then extending it to others is what this idea of purity heart is, what I kind of talked about in my sermon. That's what purity heart is really all about.
You already talked about the window, which was the basis for this particular sermon, and you talked about the family and the child holding the lily, which is a symbol of purity. But then you also talked about Jesus raising his right hand,
yes,
and what all that entails.
Yes, that image really comes from the end of Luke's gospel. And after Easter, Jesus appears to his disciples in various ways. And then at the end of 50 days, it is said that Jesus ascends into heaven, but before he ascends, he raises his hand and he speaks a word of blessing over the disciples and basically sends them, go out into the world, sends them out in the world, go and be proclaimers of the good news of God's love. And so if you put the window together now, the child is holding the lily, which is purity of heart. Jesus is extending his blessing towards them, speaking words of love and encouragement. It's a beautiful depiction of the Beatitude itself.
Right. So this definition of purity is counter to the one that we might have.
Yes.
We might define purity in another way.
Well, it's been used and abused within the life of especially the church. And the real challenge with the word purity itself is that in our world today, we have this notion of purity. It's like unchangeable perfection. We've reached this place where we've arrived and there's nothing left to be done. And for example, honey is pure when it's nothing but honey, or water is pure where it's nothing but water, or metal is pure where it's only one type of metal. Like we talk about pure silver or pure gold. And that certainly is fine to talk about those things and those items in that way. But the challenge becomes when we apply purity to people. And the challenge really becomes when we talk about the spiritual journey in terms of this idea of purity being unchangeable perfection. When purity is used in that way in the spiritual journey, what the journey really becomes is a series of do's and don'ts and dogmatic statements that we have to live up to. At the same time, the community is defined by these very black and white, clear borders about who's in and who's out. And so it's very pervasive in Christianity where this judgmental spirit lives. And it's kind of like this, puritanical type of approach to the faith. And there's so much damage that's been done in that spirit. If you're part of a community that understands that the gospel is about do's and don'ts and living up to expectations, if you're part of a community where that's the software that's running, essentially what happens is the faith becomes like this huge load of guilt and shame and fear, because deep down we're not even measuring up to our own standards for ourselves.
Right.
And so that's how purity sometimes is used. Fortunately, there's another understanding of purity that I think captures more the spirit of what Christ is up to in this beatitude. And that is, rather than purity being this unchangeable perfection, purity can be understood in terms of understanding and living into one's purpose. And this idea goes back to a philosopher, Aristotle, who believed that something was perfect or reached a place of purity, if you will, when it fulfilled its purpose. Take, for example, a cup. A cup can have a stain on the inside. It can have a chip on its little handle because it got dropped at one point. But yet it can fulfill its purpose in holding coffee or water or liquid, even in the midst of its imperfections. And now take that same idea and apply it to us as people. We as people, we're not perfect in the sense that we're never going to arrive at this place of absolute perfection. We're always going to have our shortcomings. We're always going to have our flaws. We're always changing too, by the way. You know, part of what it means to be alive is to change. And yet it is in the midst of all these things in our lives, these changes, these shortcomings, we can still fulfill our purpose for being here. And now the question becomes then, what is our purpose? The Christian understanding of our purpose is we're created in the image of God. We're created to be reflectors of God's love in this world. And once we understand that love and seek to reflect that love, really what we're doing is we're living into this purity of heart idea, and we're beginning to see God.
Before we pressed record, we were having a discussion about how my note-taking wasn't the best this week, and I'm a good note-taker. Yeah. I mean, as a reporter, I've been taking good notes for a long time. I'm very experienced at it and practiced at it. And it had nothing to do with your sermon. It really was about my attention span on Sunday. But for whatever reason, and this is for the first time this happened, because I've got a pretty good track record of keeping pretty good notes. And those notes, they form the basis of the outline for a podcast. But in the notes this week, I wrote, at this point, I said, with asterisks, I said, I got distracted and missed this part.
Well, I'll forgive you, Randy.
Part of it might have, part of it might have been was that I normally go down into the sanctuary, and
you're on the side
because of the injury. Where we sit, I didn't have a good line of sight to you. Mm-hmm. That may have been part of it, but anyway, you were using an illustration about a line on a piece of paper, and this is where I didn't get lost in the story. I just got lost. And you know what? That's the challenge for our people. That's the challenge for us.
Yes,
is to stay dialed in. So many things are going on. Not only distractions in the room potentially, but the distractions that we just bring into it. Mm-hmm. Right? What's going to happen after service? Where are we going to go for lunch? Or in even more serious things. But yeah. So I'll let you. I'm going to be paying close attention.
Get your pen out and take some notes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
No, it's actually a perfect segue into what I was talking about in the sermon. So we get lost when we forget about the first love. It's how I would that idea kind of goes back to Nouwen too. He talks a little bit about this idea of the first love. What's that? Well, it goes back to this notion of purpose. We have been created out of the abundance of God's love. We're formed, fashioned, sustained, and given hope from that love. That's where we came from. That's where we're going. And what happens as humans is we forget, right? Like we forget about the first love. We forget about where we came from. We forget what sustains us, and we forget about where we're going. We get lost. And that's what the analogy really is. It's like our life is kind of like like a blank piece of paper, and our life is like just imagine a line that's been drawn on that piece of paper. And there's a starting point, there's a finish point to that line. And it's not even a straight line. It's a line where there's ups and downs and twists and turns. And then not only that, our line is not the only line on the piece of paper. There's other lines on the piece of paper, and our lines intersect with other people and other lives, and there are twists and turns and ups and downs. And so what happens, though, is that we get so caught up with the line. We get so caught up with the lines of other people that we forget about the fact that there was a paper there from the start. And that paper, to me, represents the infinite, the unconditional love of God that we came from, and that's where we're going. And that's what the gospel calls us to say. It says, remember this. This is who you are. Even though you might not feel it, even though you might not live up to it all the time, that love is consistent and it's there. That's the foundation of the spiritual life. And when we forget about that first love, what I've noticed in my own life, Randy, is when I've forgotten about the first love, God's consistent love, God's unconditional love for me, what begins to happen is I begin to look to the world, and I expect the world and the people in the world to give me that love that I'm looking for. And so inevitably what happens is we're nice people and we're kind people, but really what we're doing is we're loving other people in hopes that they will love us back and give us that love that we long for.
That's an impure motive.
It's a very impure motive.
Yeah.
We give with the expectation of a return. And the moment we do that, we have fallen into the trap. Our love is no longer a gift. It's a curse. And pastors, we know this, right? One of the things we do every week is we give birth to a sermon. And it's like a child, really, we've created in the sense. Mm-hmm. And so you go out and you present your gift to the congregation, and you really do sometimes get caught up with living for the applause of that moment. Yeah. And that basic temptation happens repeatedly in so many other ways in our lives. We go off and we do these things. We do nice things for people. We do kind things for people. We're generous to other people. And these are fine things that we do, but when they're done with an impure motive, and what's the impure motive here? When they're done with the expectation of a return from that person, it becomes a curse. Because now this good thing that I've done for someone else, I'm waiting for it to be reciprocated back. And when that's not reciprocated back, typically what happens at that point is, if you're like me, you'll double down and do more of it. and then you wait, you kind of sit back and you wait, and you're like, okay, it's going to be reciprocated now because I did more of it. And then it doesn't happen. You become frustrated, angry, and in the end, you burn out because you've forgotten about the first love.
When you were talking about that, I thought about another story that came from another scholar that both of us like a lot, William Barclay. William Barclay talked about John Bunyan, and John Bunyan was, after one of his sermons, complimented on how good the sermon was. And he said, the devil whispered that in my ear on my way down from the pulpit.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
It's so true.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have to be careful, but we all do.
Oh, it's just human.
Yeah.
It's humanity.
Yeah.
You know, we get caught up with our line. We get caught up in the lines of others. We get living in this expectation of something in return. And it's a trap. It becomes a curse, really. And I mean, in terms of the church, what will happen is someone will come to church in hopes that the church will applaud them.
Right.
Right? Well, look, you're here. You know, and yeah, we want the church to be welcoming and hospitable and stuff like that. But when you come to a place and the reason you're there is what you get in return, you're already moving towards this part of, like, I don't know, you're already moving away from the real goal.
Right.
Yeah. You're out of tune at that moment.
You use this then to transition into something that's going on in the life of Methodist Temple, talking about the gift of God and this first gift of God. And you talked about the Methodist Temple website and the swag that our people were picking up as on the way out to celebrate the fact that we've rebranded in a sense. And there's a new website, which is much more user-friendly than the old website. Yes. And some of the signage has changed around here. And so now people are coming, and I'm wearing one of the T-shirts.
Oh, well, you are,
one of the
you?
pieces of swag.
We've got stickers for our cars now. We've got ink pens. You know,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so Anyway, last week I learned what swag meant.
I didn't know this
Did
either.
you not? Did
No,
you not?
I didn't.
I'm like, once you realize, you're like, oh, well, yeah, of course that makes sense. So swag is an acronym for stuff we are given.
Yeah.
Swag. And I think that kind of goes, you can apply that to the gospel. What are we given? It's not really stuff, technically speaking. It's not stuff. It's just God's love is given, period. And then we are called to give in response to that love, giving without the expectation of return. And that's really what swag does, right? Like when you give someone, we had a table after worship on Sunday, and people were free to go and get the totes and the pens, and nothing was expected in return.
The chip clip. That was my
the
favorite.
Chip clip. There you go. The I See Christ in You chip clip. Take that home with you. There's nothing in return we're looking for. It's just a gift. And that's more like the spirit that we're going for and we hope for. Yep.
Because you're preaching a sermon series, you needed to acknowledge that it was also Pentecost Sunday, and
Yes.
you brought that in.
Yeah, Pentecost, it really fit nicely.
Yeah.
The third thing I didn't say about the window that really kind of,
Oh.
it just fits perfectly, is above Jesus giving the blessing, there's also the dove and the spirit descending towards the family. And it works nicely because it was also in the midst of everything going on with this purity heart conversation. It's Pentecost Sunday. What's that all about? And that's been interpreted in different ways. It's really, I would argue, it's the third highest holy day in the Christian year. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost. The funny thing about
Christmas. I thought you were going to work in Mother's Day in there.
Mother's Day. That's a big one too. But, well, it's funny because on Christmas and Easter, everyone comes to church. On Pentecost, everyone gets ready for summer vacation. Right. I mean, that's what happens. But it's a massively important day theologically for us because it's on this day we celebrate the gift of the Spirit. Pentecost actually gets its roots in Jewish tradition, and we shouldn't be surprised by that. Jesus and the disciples are all Jewish, and everything is really interpreted through the lens of Jewish tradition. And so Pentecost was a festival in Judaism back in the day, and the thing they celebrated was the giving of the Torah to the Israelites. So this was the rules, if you will. This was the way that they were to live, and so they wouldn't go back to Egypt, basically. That's the idea of Torah. So on Pentecost, what happens, though, is we are given not necessarily a series of rules, but the gift of the Spirit. And what's the Spirit? Well, this is the Spirit we're called to live into as a Christian people. This is what is supposed to set us apart from the rest of the world. In a world where the tendency is to give with expectation in return, we as Christ's disciples are to trust in God's first love for us, and then out of that first love, share that love with others freely. And that's what it means to really practice the spirit of Pentecost, the same spirit that lived in Jesus Christ, the spirit that lives within us, that it all kind of fits together. This is really what the practice of church is all about.
Yeah, so you laid out the challenge. Practice love then as a gift with no expectation of anything in return.
It's so simple, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, I probably fall short of that within like three and a half minutes of waking up in the morning.
Right.
So, but yeah, but you'll notice though, I mean, just listeners and ourselves included in that, of course, those moments in which we really practice that type of love, there's a happiness there. There's a fulfillment there. I mean, it's what it means to be human and find our purpose.
Yeah. The pure in heart. All right. Next week, this Sunday, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. It's Tuesday. I don't expect you to have it.
Just gave you all I had on purity of heart. So I will. I mean, just quick one on peacemaking. It's not the absence of conflict. I think that's one of the really important things to understand when we talk about peacemaking from a biblical context. It's not really that a person doesn't endure conflict. And if you read the entirety of the Beatitudes, it's very clear that Jesus assumes there's going to be conflict. And so that's not the peacemaking he's talking about. Instead, it's really, again, back to this idea of what it is that we're called to work toward and seek to cultivate as children of God. And it's this not absence of conflict type of business, but it's more like a working for the presence of flourishing for the world around us. And that's a big part of what it means to be a Christ follower.
Okay. Very good. We'll look forward to Sunday. Hey, I wanted to share with our listeners our email addresses because we'd like to hear from you. We'd like to hear from our own people within the walls of Methodist Temple, and we're curious as to whether our message is getting outside the walls because I think, as I mentioned in our very first podcast, that our range is really unlimited, right, with the internet. Mm-hmm. So how far out are we going? So my email address here at the church is rmoore@methodisttemple.church.
And I'm A. Payton, Payton, @methodisttemple.church as well.
Yeah, we would love to hear from you. You're hearing from us, and we really do appreciate the fact that you're taking the time out. And we do hear from some people, and they share that they don't always listen to it all at once because sometimes we can get a little long-winded, but they'll listen to it in pieces. Like they'll listen to the first 10 minutes on their drive to work and the next 10 minutes on the drive home from work, and eventually they'll take it all in, and that's wonderful if you're taking it in that way. But we'd like to hear from you, just to know that you're out there, and if you have any questions or if you have any topics. We deal with the things that we deal with on a Sunday-by-Sunday basis, but we don't have to.
Nope.
We don't have to. So if you've got topics, questions that you'd like us to cover, we'd love to do that.
It would make our pastoral hearts sing.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. But we'll keep on keeping on, hoping that we're going to hear from you. And we appreciate the fact that you've been with us this week. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.
This has been the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. You are welcome to join us at Methodist Temple in person or online. Methodist Temple is at 2109 Lincoln Avenue in Evansville, Indiana. Our traditional Sunday morning worship service is at 8:30 with our contemporary service at 11. Log on to our website at methodisttemple.church. We see Christ in you.